we cannot relive it again. Neither can we peep into our future. But what if I want to live all my life at one moment? For that matter, if I want to live my life in the reverse order, death, after all, is painful. So I may want to die first and get this death out of my way. And then after taking the retirement, I work. I study and enjoy the fun enjoyment of my childhood. And finally, I end up in the home of my mother. But can these wishes of mine be actually granted? Yes, they could have been. Had I been the Benjamin in the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. But in the real life, the law of nature does not confer this right on me to live my life the way I want. Had this life actually belonged to us living beings, we would have had all the rights to live it our way, not piecemeal or in the strict order of the nature. That is why the life do not belong to the living. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all on behalf of the Group 8 to the final of this LLM challenge, whereby we are going to present this topic. It states, the law strongly supports the idea that life does not belong to the living. Well, let's just briefly see what this life is. Science, religion, as well as philosophy, they've defined life in their own peculiar way. But generally speaking, it consists of all the activities from our birth to our death. It actually defines the very existence of the human being. It is also important to understand over here that life is composed of the body as well as the mind, the material as well as the spiritual aspect. The material aspect, the body that actually relates to the aspect which is visible to the rest of the world. Whereas the mind relates to the inner, invisible world that is composed of our feelings, thought, likes, dislikes, prejudices, etc. Now this word belongs in the topic. This actually refers to the legal concept of ownership and property. Without going into much detail of what the ownership and property is, I'm sure all of you already know about it. Having the ownership of a particular property means that a certain person has rights over that particular property. So ownership is basically the bundle of rights over the thing being owned. Briefly, ownership consists of all these three rights. The right of use of that particular property, the right of possession, that is the exclusive control of that property, and then the right of disposal, which is usually done through sale, gift, or exchange, etc. Now let's just apply all these principles to the concept, to the phrase ownership of life. Firstly, this right to use and live your life, this actually entails that all human beings, all the living beings, should have all the rights to live their lives the way they want. I'll be elaborating a bit more on this later. Whereas the second and third rights, the right to possession and right to dispose of the life of the human being, it basically talks of that the decision making should rest with the human beings themselves, whether they want to live or whether they want to die. No one else should come and make the decision on behalf of them. This will be discussed with reference to death penalty, unborn child, euthanasia and suicide by the fellow speakers. Let's just first talk about this right to use and live one's life. It basically entails all these fundamental rights, all these inherent rights which a particular human being possesses, except for the right to life, which actually comes within the ambit of right to possess or dispose of the life, which will be discussed later. So all these freedoms, right to freedom of expression, right to assembly, right to association, and all other freedoms, they actually come within the banner of this right to use and live the life as one pleases. But there's a problem over here. When you actually see the related provisions of these fundamental rights in any statute or international convention for that matter, you'll actually notice that these restrictions are not absolute. Law imposes a lot of shackles and restrictions on the use of these freedoms. The first sub-article or subsection will actually enumerate the related freedom, and the very next subsection article will actually mention such a long list of these restrictions that the very use of these freedoms will become doubtful. Let me just take one other example, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is titled as Freedom of Expression. Going in the same way, the first sub-article actually describes the right to freedom of expression. And the second one, you see a long list of open-ended restrictions that is mentioned over there. And laws also given this discretion on the state to actually define what these restrictions are. Reference to prescribed by law. This automatically shows that it is on the state, it is the state's discretion that how it defines these particular restrictions. For example, let me just take the first restriction over here, which says national security, territorial integrity, and public policy. A reasonable restriction, a justifiable restriction in this regard could be where, for example, a newspaper publishes a story which, for example, declares Scotland as an independent country from the United Kingdom. But on the other hand, if I criticize the ruling elite in my country, they might prosecute me on the pretext of violating this national security, territorial integrity, or public policy. Second restriction, let's say, which talks of for the prevention of disorder and crime. A justifiable restriction could be related to hate speech, whereas the state may also come up with new crimes in order to persecute and prosecute its political rivals. So similarly, in case of all these restrictions which are mentioned over here, and also in case of other fundamental rights, there may be certain justifiable restrictions which are indispensable for the greater good of the society, for the greater good of the rest of the human beings who also want to enjoy their freedoms and these rights. But also the state using or misusing this right to define these restrictions may come up with certain unjustifiable restrictions as well, which will actually amount to depriving the human being of the use of these very freedoms we're talking about. So the bottom line is, when the law, firstly, by enumerating a long list of these freedoms, and secondly, by conferring on the state this right to actually define these open-ended restrictions, has created unpredictability and uncertainty. It actually tantamounts to depriving the human beings of their right to use these freedoms. Now, a related question. Is body the property of the living? As defined earlier, the life actually consists of body as well as mind. We may have no problem with the use of our minds because the law cannot reach there. So we may think whatever we feel like thinking. We may have certain likes and dislikes. The law cannot come to that. But as far as the body is concerned, there's established case law. It's actually, no doubt, it declares these severed parts of the body like hair, blood, or urine as a property of the human being. But when it comes to the whole body, or for that matter, unsevered part of that body, the law categorically states in R versus Bentham, a person does not even legally possess, let alone own his body or any unsevered part of it. So the law is particular about this, that the body does not belong to him. We have more examples related to this, but I'll stop here due to the paucity of time and invite Krishna to come over and talk about right to possession of life.
where the right to life is being denied to a person by law. The first being death penalty, and the second about the rights of an unborn child. With regard to death penalty, we all know it is the killing of a human being by the state where it is found that he has committed a capital offence. It has been described in many papers as judicial murder, where we see that it is one of the most extreme violations of human life, whereby a person who is convicted of an offence which is stated or for which death penalty is the punishment awarded. And it is enough if he satisfies the four corners of that law which gives a person a death penalty. So here we can clearly see that a person's right is being denied without any addressing of his will to live or die. The proponents of death penalty have argued that it is fair and required to meet the necessary evil. And even though there are international conventions which ban the use of death penalty, the world's most populous countries like United States, China, India, Pakistan, and many others still have the practice of death penalty in use. But there has been no clear proof that the use of death penalty has led to a reduction in the crime rates as claimed as one of the rationale behind having death penalty as a punishment. Moreover, we can clearly see how a person's right to life is being denied by the state, and if we are to apply the utilitarian school of thought of Jeremy Bentham, we can say that no greater good arises from this bad, which is the death penalty itself. Now, moving on to my second submission on the unborn child. The rights of an unborn child is again another grey area which even international conventions like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Child has failed to address. The rights of an unborn child is more often paired against the rights of a woman to abort her fetus or medically terminate her pregnancy. More often, we see that the fetal right suffers because it has been pitted against the abortion rights or the bodily rights of the women. So, we see that the fetus is merely treated as a dependent object which the women can terminate according to the statutes which provide for medical termination of pregnancy, and hereby the voice of the unborn is failed to be protected by the state. And when we cannot hear the voice of the unborn, we have to give it a prerogative to live. But here, we do not give the voice to the unborn child. Instead, we take it away, stifle it, and then say that the woman has the right to terminate her pregnancy. In a Canadian case law, there was a woman who had serious solvent abuse problems. So the Manitoba Health Services approached the court to make an order that the woman be committed to her rehabilitation program. However, the lower court gave an order that she be committed to a program because even 3 of her previous children had suffered severe neurological damage because of her solvent abuse problems. But the Supreme Court overruled the decision merely because the rights of the unborn was not protected by the Canadian statute. So here again we see how the rights of an unborn child, which is also a living being, and which one of the main Hippocrates oath had been to respect life from the beginning, has been denied its right to live even before it has come into existence. Thus, we can clearly see that the law has stripped, confined, and cabined life from belonging to the living, and this is a violation of the right to life of the unborn child, and also in the case of death penalty to a criminal convicted of a capital offence. Now I leave the floor to Alistair to continue the talk.
Thank you, Krishna. That's not a big start. I'll be talking to you about euthanasia, death with dignity, and the end-of-life decision-making. That is, the right to dispose of your life under those two headings. Despite the inevitability of a man's death, the time and the way in which this happens remains uncertain. It's our very ability to choose and have those decisions respected that is the way which is revealed in remaining in control and which can help preserve personal dignity when dying. The right to dispose of life means that a human being should be free to make his independent choice as to whether he wants to dispose of his life and whether he wants to live or die. However, the law does not grant the right to end one's life through euthanasia or assisted suicide. The law has always been interested in the interface between life and death. For most issues that we have to deal with, death and dying, the law governs the way this happens and the way it should be done. The most controversial aspects, however, have always been suicide and euthanasia, and consequently the attitude that the law takes in the two situations. Euthanasia, apologise to my Greek friends, comes from the word ephanestos, which means good or easy death. Often people with incurable diseases and at terminal stages ask the right for euthanasia in order to be relieved from their pain. The autonomy that these patients have requires their right to make their own decisions about their care and treatment, and for other people to respect those rights, even though a decision to withdraw treatment might lead to their own death. However, legislation and case law in numerous jurisdictions around the world have established beyond doubt that where a patient requires active help to die, it is unlawful for another person to assist them. This is a clear infringement of the principles of autonomy that a patient is allowed to end his own life. Most of the patients in these circumstances will ask to die with dignity without losing their personality, but the law does not allow them to die in the way that they wish. This argument strongly suggests that the law does not support that life belongs to the living. Self-achieved suicide and assisted suicide. Suicide is distinguished in two ways, self-achieved and assisted. The law is now clear under the Suicide Act 1961 as amended in the United Kingdom that self-achieved suicide is no longer a criminal offence. However, the law towards suicide is unfavourable. Under Section 2.1 of the Suicide Act, this criminalises assistance in suicide as a permissible limitation of the right to life by the European Court of Human Rights.